Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. I'm back after 2 weeks vacation. I'm really grateful to Carla Robbins for moderating the past two panels. I'm fearing for my seat, but she says, no, perfectly fine to come back in the way we are. So Carla, it's great to have you back as a participant rather than moderator, but really appreciate you taking over while I was sipping very good red wine in Tuscany. Big week this week, big summit weeks. We had a meeting with the EU summit. We had a big G7 meeting in Schloss Elmo near where Stefan hangs out in the Bavarian Alps, and a NATO meeting in Madrid. They all took place. They all ended on time. Those were good things. At the same time, we were trying to revive the Iran nuclear deal with senior U.S. and Iranian officials flying to Doha. And we'll take a final look at the 25th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China. So lots to talk about. Stefan, let's start with you. The EU summit had actually quite unexpected, but good outcome in having candidate status being awarded to Ukraine and Moldova, though not to Georgia. And of course, the Western Balkans remained deeply unhappy with the progress on their status within the EU. But it sort of set this tone for the week that there is a division in Europe, and Ukraine is on one side and Russia is on the other side. And that sort of played into the G7 summit. How did you see what happened in Brussels, and then importantly under the German presidency of the G7?
Right. I mean, these were really intense days, and the EU summit basically set the tone for what should come. The division is clear. Ukraine is ruling all decisions. The EU simply couldn't avoid taking in Ukraine as a candidate for EU membership. That doesn't mean a lot. I mean, that means a bit of money for Ukraine in case they want to reform things and if they want to change internal procedures. But the most important thing is the message. The most important thing is simply to give that a symbol of unity and that symbol of bringing Ukraine into the West. And that is probably the most devastating news for Vladimir Putin, because if we remember rightly, the reason for him to invade Ukraine in the first place and occupy Crimea and the Donbass in 2014 was the 2013 Maidan upheaval in Ukraine, which was triggered by Ukraine not being led closer to the European Union. So that's the sequence we are seeing now, a much clearer focus on where Ukraine should belong, and the political win of the West is huge and basically coming from that summit. The leaders tried to transform this kind of win to the G7, which wasn't actually that successful because they ran out of steam somehow. G7 is always a difficult thing to plan and to organize. It's more sort of a show of unity, a show of democracies, Western states, very few leaders. It is psychologically extremely important. I mean, sitting together for 3 days at such level gives a lot of possibilities to talk and to get to know each other much more closely. And some of those leaders were new in the shop. First of all, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor. So it was an important thing that they met and talked. But then again, in terms of outcome, the United States tried to get this oil cap organized, really didn't succeed because it was extremely badly planned and thought through. On the German side, the idea of having a climate club and committing again to some serious climate goals didn't succeed. So they came up with some infrastructure money to tackle the Belt and Road idea. They came up with basically some little pledges for Ukraine, unity pledges. And if there wouldn't have been NATO already looming in the wings with an increase in the Rapid Reactions Force up to 300,000 fighters, the Elmo summit basically would have mostly gone unnoticed in the broader world. Scholz takes it as a success. Well, he definitely has to. There wasn't any major grievance. There wasn't any major fight amongst those seven. Macron, probably most noticeable, who was dithering before this summit on whether he should now side more with Putin or not, and gave some really mixed signals, clearly understood where he belongs to. So in the end, again, a symbol of unity, determination, tough words for Russia and Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky was beamed into the room, so he's part of all those world meetings, and everyone parted happily to Madrid.
Stefan, can I ask you to talk a bit about the first item you mentioned, which is the membership candidacy for Ukraine? Because I guess I'm very alert to signs of division within the EU, and there was in the run-up, and I covered it back in 2013, the association agreement with Ukraine. Same thing happened. Ukrainians actually at the time wanted membership, and there was a lot of pushback from the Dutch and some of the original member states, for lack of a better word. Whereas you had the Balts and the Poles really trying to get the Ukrainians membership status. We saw some of those divisions develop in the run-up to the summit, but it seems like the Commission and the Balts sort of were able to overcome that. Is there still this reluctance amongst some of the original older member states to allow the Ukrainians to join because of some of the issues that they've had prior, or do you really think this is a sign of unity there?
No, it is still there. It's mostly the Dutch, the Austrians, the Spanish, sometimes even the Italians, and the main issue is money. If you would apply the give and take mechanism of the EU in terms of money, the spending mechanism, with a member Ukraine being part of the club, most of EU money would go to Ukraine because of need, because of the sort of the calculations which are behind it. And this is why even a country like Poland, which is a net taker of EU money right now, would suddenly become a country which wouldn't receive any fundings anymore. So this is the biggest driving force within the EU, who gets what. But membership is so far away for Ukraine. It's simply a symbol at this moment. And being an accession candidate just means that the EU is standing ready to provide help if need be. We all know that a country in war will most likely not join the EU, but nevertheless, it does create major conflicts, especially because we have so many countries waiting for this kind of accession status in the Western Balkan, Bulgaria blockading these moves. So yes, there's a new sense of urgency, and from the sitting countries, from the sort of the old members of the EU, a serious demand now to make up their mind on how this club could be run in that size, in that hugeness. Anonymous decision making is a big problem. Funding is a big problem. So the EU needs to make some serious soul searching to find a way how it should be stay operational.
It's been interesting to see us listen to Macron on this, because he has proposed yet another organization where the Brits could probably join into this, and the Ukrainians, which would be less formal than the EU, but some sort of broader thing. And there are other OECD, there are other organizations that already exist on this, Council of Europe. But it seems like Macron wants to create another one, which is interesting to watch, just that perhaps there's a core and then an outer ring that the Brits and the Ukrainians could join.
Yeah, but that's not on arrival.
Boris Johnson wants to create another one, which has some EU and some North African countries, and they all want to create. They're all architects because they have nothing else to do, I guess, or one way or another. Stefan, thanks for that background. And Peter, I wanted to get to one of the issues that Stefan raised, which is sort of an underlining issue. Was this a badly prepared meeting, or were there so many differences that would had to be put under the ground? And I'm particularly thinking about the oil cap, because that was a big issue that the administration came to. And I've read every story, and I'm sure you've reported even more and read more of it. I still don't know what they're trying to do. Is that part of the problem?
This is why I was asking Stefan about the divisions, because I think the longer this goes on, again, what this week was a show of unity. But below the headlines, there were a lot of cracks. And I think we talked about this the last time I was on, which is you're seeing that politics, domestic politics, for Germany, for the US, for other countries to begin to seep into this as the war continues. And then domestic support for really hardline measures against the Russians is beginning to fade. And Germany is the place where this is the most evident because it is suffering the most from the spike in oil prices because of the Russian sanctions. So what the administration is trying to do, and this is frankly coming from Treasury, because we were getting briefed on it frankly months ago, trying to create a mechanisms where you hit a cap and that doesn't go over there, and that the government's agreed to sort of basically buy fuel at that level. Again, when you talk to economists, it could work. It would take a lot of money to fund, but it is right now a U.S.-led idea that seems to have very little support anywhere else. We've heard even this morning now that the U.S. has said they're going to go forward with it and try to implement it and try to convince people to join in, even though they didn't get agreement at the G7 or elsewhere on it. But it gets to this whole issue about domestic political pressures. I mean, what you hear repeatedly out of the White House is going into the midterms and going to 2024, all their polling shows that people are scared about rising petrol prices, as we say in the Ukraine, rising gas prices. And, particularly with winter, not that far away, I think both in Europe and in the US, the politicians are just getting nervous about this. Scholz's numbers are down in Germany. Macron's numbers are down. Biden's numbers are rock bottom. And so I think the reason I asked Stefan that question is I just think that after the initial sort of euphoria is the wrong word, but, the original surprising unity that everyone was patting themselves on the back for, and then the Russian losses around Kiev, we're seeing Russian advances in the East. We're seeing domestic pressures politically on all these leaders. And I just worry that as the summer carries into the winter, that this show of unity that we've seen over the last week will just be that, just a show. And then in substance, they're really going to struggle to get any new action going. Because, again, I talked to an EU source of mine, there is discussion about yet another round of sanctions, but he said, dead on arrival, there's no chance of getting a seventh package. So I think we're really running into a stasis position now because of, frankly, lack of unity on policy.
Yeah, Carla, one way I've heard it described is sort of the war of attrition is going on at two levels. At the tactical level, we're seeing that on the ground, but really on the strategic level, we're seeing it in terms of the staying power of Putin versus the staying power of Western support for Ukraine. Putin, by the way, is also suffering significant damage because of the sanctions. Is that the right way to look at it? Is that how you look at it? And if so, how worried or confident are you on the strategic level, the domestic support for continuing the pressure on Ukraine, which it's a lot, but relative to everything else we do is still quite small.
I mean, Biden seems completely committed, and every time you turn around, he's making another commitment, $800 million more in weapons that he announced yesterday. This really is a 20th century conflict, and he's a 20th century conflict sort of guy. He totally gets it. And I think that, if you look at the polling data in the United States, I mean, very few pollsters ask the salience question, what are you willing to pay for this? But if you ask them about the Ukraine conflict, people get it. They definitely get, this is an old style conflict, and they get the East versus West conflict still. I think, the whole impulse here is everybody thought that, Putin was really going to be brought to his knees by, oil sanctions. And instead what's happened is he's getting richer than ever because oil prices have gone up. So you can understand why they're trying to figure out a way of not just lowering petrol prices, but also a way of keeping him still selling, but not making so much money off of it. And it's a very perverse incentive system here. Janet Yellen's, who's trying to come up with this jury-rigged system here, is a very smart economist. I can think of a million ways why it would go wrong, not least because the Russians could just decide not to sell. The people who are buying it don't necessarily have to agree. They think they can do it by, putting pressure on insurers and on shipping. They had considerable success on this with the Iranians, but the oil market is just, it's a very touchy sort of thing to mess around with. And you could see so many ways where this could go wrong. But this is the fundamental problem they have right now. It's as Peter's absolutely right, it's a domestic political problem, but it's also a global economy problem. And in the end of the day, Putin's just getting richer day by day. And yes, his economy will ground to a halt eventually because he doesn't have semiconductors. But right now, he's getting richer by the day.
Well, in that respect, I mean, the G7 was really an eye-opener. The low point was that so-called outreach format where all the sort of BRICS countries, the global South, India, South Africa, Argentina, where Indonesia were coming in and not committing a single thing on that war against Russia. And definitely they're the benefactors of Russian oil. They don't have the slightest interest in joining these ideas. Actually, even having their own summit of the BRICS countries just 4 days before, which is just poking in your eyes and saying, well, the global South, 2/3 of the world are not behind this.
Yeah, it's a remarkable example. I mean, and India, of course, as the one country, and South Africa, who went to the BRIC summit and then came to Elmo and just poking their eye on saying, we're going to do whatever we're going to do, and it shows that I think the hope here was that there was a Goldilocks strategy for sanctions, one that could hurt them but not us. Turns out, when you take on a big global economy particularly that owns the kind of critical commodities as fossil fuels, and we'll see it in minerals as well, it's hard. It's easier to hit them with pain. It's just hard to avoid the pain here at home. Stefan, others, thanks for this. Let's shift to the next and final meeting that we had, the NATO Summit, which started off with exactly the way you would want any summit started off, with the Turks, the Finns, and the Swedes making up and agreeing, or at least on for the early part, and went better ever since. So, Peter, how do you look at this at the summit, and what are the sort of the big achievements, and what questions do you have left after this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, compared to the G7, the one that was more successful, with the headline of resolving the Turkish issue on Finland, Sweden. Although, frankly, Erdogan by the end of the week was also making noises that maybe I'm not 100% behind this now. But he seems to have been bought off with an upgraded F-16s from the U.S., which is, I think, is a pretty good result. Other headlines that came out, obviously, was the Stoltenberg announcement that the Rapid Reaction Force would go from 40,000 to 300,000. The U.S. announced that they were going to put a headquarters in Poland. Again, something that Putin really didn't like. I mean, frankly, he hated the fact that when the Bush administration way back was thinking about putting missile defense radars in Poland and the Czech Republic, that was a bit of a trigger for him. Now you actually have a permanent U.S. base in Poland, which is something he didn't really want. And then, as Carla said, the return to sort of 20th century Cold Warriorism. I mean, there's a new strategic outline that they released that is, Russia is clearly the enemy again. And I was reminded by the Lord Ismay, First Secretary General, who said the point of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And other than the Germans down, it feels like we're back to the Lord Ismay, post World War II era NATO. And
there may be some Europeans who also want to keep the Germans down. That hasn't changed either for some.
That's also true. That's also true.
Put it out there.
Don't take it personally, Stefan.
Yes, nothing personally. I would just say, though, under all of those headlines, there is something less than meets the eye, which again makes me a little bit concerned. So again, although it looks like Finland and Sweden are going to join, the Turks are still behaving a little erratically here, and are threatening yet again, after signing the thing, to hold up final session because of issues with the PKK and terrorists that are being held by the Finns and the Swedes in particular. That 300,000 number, Stoltenberg said it, but Ivo, you remember better than I that these rapid reaction forces are on paper. Whether they are actually, boots on the ground that can be deployed, I've always been suspicious. They had a hard time getting 40,000. Stoltenberg and other briefings we got from other NATO countries, they were a little bit scratching their head where Stoltenberg got this 300,000 number, and I'm not sure that is there's much there just yet. Let's remain to be seen. And again, this new strategic paper, although important in that it signals we're back to sort of old Cold Warriorism, and there is some deployments that the U.S. has agreed to do and the UK has agreed to do in the Baltics, in Romania, to up the numbers. They are relatively limited, and they're rotations. We're not talking big massing of troops and permanent bases. Then the Poland base is just a headquarters. It is not a proper, Germany-style kind of, World War II era, Cold War era bases. So there's a lot of rhetoric, and I just think when the rubber hits the road, it's going to be very, very underwhelming. And I just only say that because of my experience covering NATO in Brussels, there always is a lot of top line coming out of a summit. Look at these great things we've achieved. And then 6, 12, 18 months later, when you ask, where are those troops for the rapid reaction forces? Where is the actual deployments? It never seems to be live up to the claims on the end of the summit. But look, there is, as Stefan said, something to be said for show of Western unity at this point, and that was achieved. The Sweden and Finland thing seems to be real. I just would keep an eye on these commitments to step up forces in Europe, particularly in the East, because I guess, I've been skeptical in the past, and they haven't actually materialized anything. And I think it's important to keep the NATO's feet on the fire on this one to see if they actually do live up to the commitments for the 300,000 in particular, and some of the rotational units they'll be going through, some of the Baltics and former Warsaw Pact countries.
Carla, you have the same sort of sense, great commitments, question about whether people will actually fulfill them?
I think the Americans are going to. I mean, I think that they're, we were just in the end of the Trump administration talking about, having or cutting even more American troops in Germany and all of that. These deployments after Crimea were, rotational deployments. I mean, even if it just is for the 5 Corps, I think they call themselves the 5 Corps now, no longer the 5th Corps. Even at just a headquarters is a significant thing for Poland. The notion that we've given up this notion that we're no longer going to, that we're never going to permanently deploy on, along the borders there, that's all gone. We're there, and nobody's saying anything other than, we're willing to be there permanently, and we're willing to have other countries be there permanently. And that's a pretty strong statement there. But the other thing that didn't come out of it, and that it really says, is this is increasing European dependence on the United States, not decreasing European dependence on the United States. And NATO is going to have to figure out, both for political sustainability in the United States and for the reality of this is a long conflict. No matter how Ukraine ends, or more likely doesn't end, the Europeans are going to have to figure out, what they're going to do to be able to be a true partner in this. That's one of the big lessons of this. And I think that's my biggest disappointment about this. I didn't feel, from their big paper, and I didn't feel from the conversation that they explained how they're really going to move forward with this. Yeah, the 300,000 number was a nice number, but how are they going to move forward so that they can truly develop their competence on things like lift and intelligence and refueling and all the competencies that they're going to need to be a genuine partner moving forward? Because that's one of the biggest lessons here. Yeah, the Americans can come and they can put in more ships in Rota, and they can have, more cruisers, they can do all of those things, but it's not sustainable in the long run, particularly because the United States has other concerns, including China. And that's the big fight in Washington right now. All these people are saying, what about the pivot to Asia? So the sustainability issue is going to be a big one. But for now, I think the American commitment's a real one.
I would just to echo what Carla was saying, that's kind of why I went back to the Ismay quote, because it was the Americans in, right? And that was the most telling thing. Again, if you remember, I guess it was Obama era, pivot to Asia, not only pivot to Asia, but there was serious discussions about drawing down in Germany, and that there was commitments to move brigade size forces outside of Germany and redeploy them in Asia and whatnot. That is not only not going to happen now, but reversing. But Carla, you've pinpointed the problem here, which is basically for 20 years, the Europeans kept saying, the Americans are leaving, the Americans are leaving, the Americans are leaving. We will now raise our capabilities, both in spending and there's been various, Berlin Plus and WEU. I mean, all these different constructs that were supposed to be the European pillar of NATO that never happened. And it now, when push comes to shove, when they actually should have had something in place that they could be deployed, it's not there. And I think you're 100% right in signaling, yet again, they're being forced to rely on the U.S. as a security umbrella, when we thought that had all changed in the last 20 years.
Well, but Peter, we all know that the Europeans are aware of the problem. I'm not sure whether they know how to solve it, but they are deeply aware of it, and they just fear the comeback of any type of Trump personality from in Washington, which leads to the exodus. And we shouldn't, secondly, we shouldn't really forget that all these decisions, all the summit was held under this tremendous pressure from the war. The 300,000 decision was simply made in light of an immediate danger of a Baltic invasion. I mean, we have the Kaliningrad escalation, which is now being winded down by the Commission. They are backpedaling. They are taking steps back not to embargo goods going from Russia to Kaliningrad. and just trying to get out of the line of fire there. But in the end, everyone is aware that the Baltics could not be defended, and the Estonian president was extremely outspoken about that briefly before the summit, saying, "Well, you're sacrificing us, you're seeing us being slaughtered here, and then you decide after so many days to probably fight back." The core problem of NATO is operability in Europe, and it's simply not there. There's small things changing in Europe. Just take defense industry procurement, for example. The German government, again, a red-green government, some kind of liberals in it, are changing laws which will make it much easier to export German defense goods, which is one of the main obstacles for a stronger European joint defense industry. It's as we speak, they are changing these laws. As we speak, they lowered the threshold on which Germany has a veto right for those sales. So things are moving, but yes, they're moving far too slow.
And we'll see the test in this. I mean, whether Germany finally delivers what it committed to Ukraine, and whether it lets the Spanish deliver what they want to deliver to Ukraine that the Germans have end user certificate issues on. So we've got near-term, tests even in the next few weeks to see. Scholz says a lot of things. Whether he follows through, we're going to see.
Well, the howitzers are there now. Their 2-3 defense missile systems will be delivered on the Marder and the Leopard tanks. There is simply a supply problem. I mean, those weapons are there, but if you want to operate them in the front, you need to have a system which goes back basically to the factory to supply spare tools, to have maintenance ready-made. This is simply not present in Ukraine. You can't build it up from scratch within a few weeks. This is why they're hesitating, and even the Spanish are. I mean, they're extremely loud now on wanting to send those high-tech tanks, but they simply cannot run them there. And so you find arguments on all sides, but I agree, Carla, this is the crunch, the test will be made this summer, whether we are getting tired of all of this and whether the cracks we're seeing now in Ukrainian defense are really widening or things are slowing down, grinding to a halt.
But there, in some ways, Stefan, I think you're absolutely right. I think this summer, next 6 months really is the critical period for Ukraine. But that also sort of reinforces the critical period for NATO to make sure that whatever has been agreed will in fact be implemented. Because failure in Ukraine or not achieving real success does increase the pressure on NATO for NATO to be able to defend its own territory. One of the reasons why Germany and Canada and the UK have now agreed to up their presence, perhaps not permanently, but the capacity from a battalion to combat brigade size in the Baltic states. Another reason why having Finland and Sweden being part of NATO is so critical. You now all of a sudden have a country 70 kilometers from Tallinn that can help defend Tallinn. It's a different defense in depth that didn't exist before. But it gets back to this point that, boy, we've been arguing for over 50, 60, 70 years. And anybody who's read their early Kissinger about the balance between European and American capabilities. And it is striking to say that the United States is going to deploy 2 squadrons of F-35s to the UK, which is the same of what Germany has decided to buy as part of the 100 billion euros. It is increasing by 50% its cruiser capability in Rota. It's increasing the brigade strength by a third. We're going from 3 to 4 brigades. And the total manpower is going to be increased by over 25, perhaps 30% that the U.S. is providing. And I agree with Carla. All of that's going to happen because we have the capability and put it in there. We'll have a big fight in Washington down the road about if there is a crisis in the Indo-Pacific on that. But I don't see the strategy, frankly, on the Washington side or, for that matter, on the European side to say, okay, when are the Europeans going to do their own defense? I think Germany have made some big decisions, but where's that going to go? Where are the French? Not even talking about the Spaniards and the Italians. What's the UK going to do? in order to make sure that there is a bigger balance between U.S. versus non-U.S. I think that's a big question that we will have to watch over the weeks and months ahead.
Ivo, isn't the question?
I'm sorry, Stefan, please.
Go ahead. No, Carla, please.
No, I was just going to ask Ivo a question. I mean, I somehow expected there'd be some clarity on this in the strategic concept, and there just seemed to not be there. Did they try and fail to get it, or did they not even try?
I don't know the whole backstory on the strategic concept, and there at some point we'll all find out. But they had written a strategic concept that was sort of Ukraine. It was going to be the 3 Cs, and Stoltenberg had talked about it. China, cyber, and climate. NATO was going to be global. It was going to be all of this thing, and then the war happens, and they remind them, "Oh, shoot! We're a military alliance defending NATO territory," and so they then rewrote it, and it became like a communique. Everything that anybody wanted was thrown in there. Then finally they said that's just really not the way to do a strategic concept. And the way it reads to me, but maybe I'm just too deep into it, is they took the 2010 strategic concept and threw out everything that made no sense from 2010 and just added. There's a lot of threats out there, and they put every threat they could possibly think of in there, just made Russia the big threat, and then basically kept the same strategic concept. We still believe in partnerships. NATO EU is a really important thing. Our partners in Asia are really important, and that's it. And it's only 10 pages. That's a very short strategic concept. And I'm not sure they had time to think through what is the relative balance between the United States and Europe. By the way, Biden doesn't help on that. As you said, he's a 20th century president for a 20th century conflict, and he really believes in American leadership. And he wants to demonstrate this in a way that is pretty traditional. I think that's where we are. But we can't avoid the question, no matter what about 2024, we can't avoid the question that 75 years after the end of World War II, Europe needs to do more for its own defense, just for the health of its own defense. And the Germans can lead that now that they are taking some really serious steps on the defense side.
Stefan, can I just ask you to address that? Because that has always been fascinating to me. I mean, and it also, I know this may be too in the weeds, but it also just, in my mind, brings up the issue of Brexit, where if you had, I mean, the 2 most deployable militaries in Europe have always been the French and the British, right? At least when the Brits were inside the room in the EU, you had, it was always awkward, but those discussions would happen. Now you have the German commitment to up its defense capabilities, and obviously they're in the room with the French. I've talked to some EU people who said it's much easier now with the awkward Brits out. We can actually properly talk about common defense within the EU structure. But you do have, again, a very capable military in the UK that's not in the room there. What is that? Do you have a sense of how UK, France, and Germany work to try to develop capabilities? Because those are the 3 countries that are going to matter when you look forward in terms of a European pillar or whatever you want to call it to NATO.
Well, but it won't happen within the European pillar. I mean, it will happen within NATO. It's about defense planning there, and not about NATO capability, EU capabilities. And this is what actually every German strategist who's doing these plannings right now knows by heart, because it's a way to actually bind the US and bind the UK, and they all know they need to do this. I found it extremely interesting to watch how Boris Johnson was tiptoeing around the EU issues on those summits. I mean, he was in Brussels at the EU summit. He was there. He was not present, but he was in the room. And G7 and NATO. He's definitely looking for being part of that structure and not being seen as the odd man out. The question is speed and credibility, and the amount of German spending is really altering the landscape. If this really hits the road, the balance of power within Europe will change dramatically. And I'm just waiting for the day where this is going to be a problem for France, for example, or others. So it has to be watched as well. I don't see that much coordination as there should be, kind of sharing of duties there, whatever. I mean, you're doing refill, you're doing intelligence, or let's build up some joint drone defense, for example. It's not happening. And I wonder whether, that was my question to Carla and to Ivo, I mean, isn't that this overpresence of the United States, isn't that kind of an answer also to the Pacific problem? I mean, if this is going to be lost in Europe, if if the US shows weakness here, that's just a prelude from what will happen in the Pacific. So you better make this a success here, just in case to avoid more trouble with China.
Yeah, and I think, Stefan, that's a very good point. You can't avoid seeming weak here just because you want to be strong in the other place. It's why there really isn't a difference between the Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theaters. They are entirely linked, because how you behave in one will affect how it behaves in the other. We've talked about Taiwan versus Ukraine, et cetera, exactly in that point.
And they tried to make that symbolic point, right? They invited the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the treaty allies, the Australians and New Zealanders. They showed up in Madrid as well, and I think they were trying to make that point. And I think that's very front of mind.
I mean, although I'd like to remind people that we're also in Chicago in 2012, so it's not like it's the first time. But yes, the point was the point was made, and it's an important point. Though, when the Quad meets, they don't invite the NATO Secretary General, and so anyway, a larger piece. By the way, I wrote a piece about that in Foreign Affairs in the recent issues, so you can all look at that. Why it's important to bring those things together. Carla, I want to jump to the meeting that, I don't know what happened. All of a sudden, it's looked like after a visit by the EU to Tehran, the talks were back, and then they kind of weren't. Where are we on the Iran nuclear talks?
Oh, Lucy and the football. Come on. So, EU brokered indirect talks. You just wondered, there they are, sitting in their hotel rooms, ordering room service. In Doha, ended, no progress yet again. They just can't quit each other because the alternative is too grim. The things that Iran is asking for, they thought they had a deal in March, and then it came down to a few remaining things. And the things that Iran is asking for, it's just not going to get. And I never say in defense of Iran, because they're indefensible, but I will say that they have pretty good reasons to mistrust the US after Trump pulled out of the deal in the first place. Iran wants the Biden administration to commit to lifting a large swath of non-nuclear related sanctions as part of any deal, including removing the Revolutionary Guard from the U.S. state sponsors of terrorism list. Trump put them on the list. They deserve to be on the list, but it's politically impossible for Biden to take them off. It wants a promise that the next U.S. administration won't renege on any deal. You can see why they would ask for it. You could also see why it's impossible to give it to them. There's also reporting that Iran is now insisting that the IAEA the nuclear inspector stop looking into undeclared nuclear material that it's found in Iran over the past 3 years. If they wanted to take a Sharpie and write guilty, guilty, guilty on their foreheads, they would do that. It couldn't be more brazen. Most of this stuff isn't new. And Iran started violating the deal after Trump pulled out. But what's worrying about this is that, that the pace of violations is speeding up, and the time until a so-called nuclear breakout, which really basically means they'll have enough nuclear fuel to make a bomb, doesn't mean they will be able to make a bomb. They'll have enough hardware, but they'll have enough fuel, is getting shorter and shorter. The IAEA doesn't know exactly how, in part because the Iranians have turned off the cameras, but they estimate that the stockpile of enriched uranium is more than 15 times the amount allowed under the original deal. And it could be weeks and maybe even days away from having enough weapons-grade uranium. And that's a pretty frightening thing. So the Americans and the Europeans walked away from this and said, nothing happened. Waste of time. We're annoyed, And the Iranians, interestingly enough, the Iranian ambassador to the UN said, oh, no. We thought there was some progress, and we would really like to get back to the table. And we're going to be sending the Europeans a message in the next day or so about how we'd like to have another meeting. Biden is going to Israel, and then he's going to Saudi. We're going to see what those consultations look like. The subtext of that is always going to be Iran. To a certain extent, Biden has been outsourcing his, Iran policy to the Israelis for a very long period of time, which is pretty frightening. I think that if he hears, that the Israelis want to get even harder line, certainly the Saudis want to get even harder line, I think he's going to snap back to wanting to have more negotiations because the alternative is just too grim. He does not need another war right now. So if I had to bet, we'll be talking about this again, Ivo, and they'll be back not making a lot of progress, except for the tick, tick, tick of that enrichment clock. I don't have an answer on this one.
Stefan, how does... Go ahead, Peter.
I was going to ask, does the prospect of a Trump 2024, does that motivate the Iranians or demotivate the Iranians? Because in one sense, as you said, Carla, the credibility of the U.S. on this issue was so undermined by Trump's withdrawing from the program that why would we even negotiate with the Americans again with the prospect of it coming again 2-3 years? On the other hand, you do have an American president who is more reasonable. And therefore, you should, and particularly with maybe Netanyahu coming back in Israel, and obviously, the Gulfi is very, very focused on the Iranians as a threat. As you said, the threat of them joining back together and becoming even more hardline than Washington is. So I guess the question in the Iranians' mind must be: is there a window of opportunity now with Biden, or is it pointless because I got Trump coming again in potentially 2 or 3 years, so why would I even negotiate?
Well, that assumes that there is a single actor in Iran, which adds to the complexity of this. A lot of the negotiating is going on Iran to Iran here. The Revolutionary Guard has actually been making more and more money through this ban because they've been selling the stuff themselves on the black market, and they've been getting richer out of the control of the government. So who knows what they want out of this deal? As much as the government keeps saying take them off the terrorism list, I don't think they're suffering particularly. I would think that what the Iranian government wants is they don't want their people to be constantly knocked off by the Israelis. Certainly, the government itself would like to be back on the market selling oil. I mean, they've got terrible inflation problems, huge unemployment. They have suffered. There's no question that these sanctions have hit them hard. And yes, I would mistrust. I mean, certainly we couldn't blame them that they would want, want a deal that would actually stick the same way everybody else in the world would like to know that the U.S. was a long time reliable interlocutor, but they're not going to get that one. And then the question becomes exactly as you said, Peter, do they, which part of the government wants the pressure off? I think a big part of the pressure is they want that assassination campaign to end.
Stefan, of course, the Europeans, this is, in some ways it's their deal. They started the negotiations at least, and the EU's very much involved. Borrell's visit to Tehran sort of reopened the door to talks that didn't take place. How does it look from Berlin in terms of where we're going to go with this?
It looks really bleak, and quite honestly, the EU is mostly to be blamed for that failure last Wednesday, because those 2 days of talk. I mean, if you convene those parties in Doha for a meeting, you better should prepare for it. And I'm not aware that there was much preparation going on. There was no testing the waters on neither side. I mean, yes, there was a sort of pre-crew going to Tehran from Brussels trying to find negotiation substance, but they pretty much came unprepared. So that was a really fruitless exercise. And I wonder who in Europe feels in charge of this. It is mostly left with the EU foreign policy wing, with the High Commissioner. But Borrell seems to be rather unprepared and uninterested, much other than his predecessors. And with this very able deputy leader in the EU foreign policy wing, Helga Schmidt, who was leading negotiations for almost 8 or 10 years, starting with Joschka Fischer in the early days, in the early 2000s. I mean, this goes way back. There's no trust there anymore. There are no people they can talk to, and probably no fresh ideas either. So I am just can repeat what Carla said. I don't know how that should continue now. They seem to be running out of ideas.
Peter, I want to give you one minute before we go to just reflect on the 25th anniversary of the handover for Hong Kong, which was a deal to respect one country, two systems for 50 years. She came to Hong Kong, first foreign trip, and talked about how Hong Kong had risen from the ashes. How are we supposed to take all of this?
Well, I mean, the headline was he actually left Beijing, right? I mean, for the zero COVID policy, he'd been stuck in Beijing for the last 2 years. So the fact he actually traveled, it shows how symbolic this is. Look, I mean, any of us who has news organizations who have big offices in Hong Kong, or Western companies who have presence in Hong Kong, know that this is just not true, right? Everyone now is fleeing Hong Kong. Its future as a financial center is at great risk. You had, I mean, from a media point of view, the national security laws, the New York Times left its operations, moved to Seoul. The Washington Post moved its operation out of Hong Kong, moved to Seoul. We're also thinking about, we were owned by a Japanese company. Should we relocate to Japan? I mean, Hong Kong as a center for media and coverage of Asia is now at risk. People moving to Singapore. But as a financial center, which is what it always has been for Asia, it is also at risk. Again, people moving to Singapore, people thinking in Tokyo. I think Hong Kong, as we knew it for basically a century, is now over. And Xi got what he wanted, which was a rather bloodless stifling of the opposition movement, a complete control by Beijing over Hong Kong. And for those of us, again, I spent a huge amount of time as a reporter in Hong Kong, but I did do various stints there. It's a very sad outcome that has really, I think, once again, has lessons for the West in here. When we think about Taiwan and whatnot, is that we have very, red lines are easily broached if there is lack of will and a lack of strength on the Western side. It was the agreements that were made during the handover have not been lived up to, and the UK, which was the guarantor, and the West more generally has done nothing about it. And I think that sends the wrong signal to Beijing when they look at Taiwan. But it's also, with the litany of the things we can talk about the ascendancy of autocrats across the world. I think this is just one that is slightly getting lost in the shuffle, given there are larger issues. But it's a sad moment for the values that we hold dear as Western democracies, and I think it will be one of those horrible footnotes when we look back on the 21st century of mistakes that we made and things we let go, because Hong Kong is no longer Hong Kong.
No, I think that puts it well, and it sort of emphasizes the really important point that he violated every rule in the book and he got away with it. And to come to Hong Kong triumphant in the way that he did in the last 24 hours, really with no cost to China, no cost to anyone except to the people of Hong Kong, and the freedom that they were guaranteed for another 25 years, which has now been snuffed out. So sad moment, but also some real realpolitik playing out. And it's this kind of realpolitik that we're seeing everywhere returning. That too is a sad moment as we forget about a lot of the issues that we should be paying attention to, whether it's climate or the global food crisis that is affecting so many people. But I can't think of three better people to have had this discussion than Peter Spiegel, U.S. editor of news, U.S. news editor at Financial Times, Carla Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations, and moderator stand-in supreme, and Stefan Kornelius, political editor of Süddeutsche Zeitung. I want to thank all three of you and for joining us, and for everyone else who was tuning in. Tune in again next week for another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend. Bye-bye.